Jim Schaefer, the host and producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Henry Greenspan, who will discuss his new book on listening to Holocaust survivors, recounting and life history. We were talking yesterday about this book, and one of the things we agreed on, one of the key concepts is this idea of listening, and listening over a long period, and to those telling their stories, not once, but many times over decades. This is a singular quality of your project that resulted in this book. Can you talk a little bit about that and about the people as they recounted the vividness of the experience they had in the Holocaust?
Yeah, I think it may make sense to talk a little bit about how the project started, because I didn't intend, or I didn't plan when I first sat down with people that I would be talking with some of them over a period of what is now 20 years, as has turned out to be the case. This was a natural product of getting to know people and the circumstances of the time. When I was first interviewing people in the 1970s, I think my first interview was in 77, this was before there were many of the oral history projects that we have now. In fact, there was virtually none. There were a few, one in Israel, one in New York, but really very little of what we now have. Holocaust museums didn't exist in anything like the scale, certainly the numbers that we have now. Memorial centers didn't exist, education projects. Even within academia, there was relatively little at that time. There are a few major studies, but nothing like the proliferation of books that we now have about the Holocaust in general and about survivors in particular. So when I sat down, I was frankly surprised to find out that I was often the first person with whom these survivors had spoken, other than to other survivors or sometimes their family members, about these experiences. I was blown away by that. I was amazed by that. And so for me, it became a kind of a natural commitment, really a feeling of being responsible for some of this that I hadn't anticipated right away. And it was for those survivors too, I think, almost a surprise at that point that someone, I mean, they referred to me as an American. I mean, they are Americans too, but meaning someone not of European background, someone born in this country, who really wanted to know and took an interest. And so people said most of the time, after our first conversation, come back next week. You know, come back, we'll talk some more. You should talk to my friend too. You know, one naturally led to another. It's also true that as a psychologist, you know, it's one of my professional biases, I guess, that it takes more than one conversation to really get to things about any topic. And so although this was not part of any psychotherapy, it's a natural bias of my own typical modus operandi to want to talk with people more than once. Of course, then that gave me the chance to go back to think about what we had talked about week one. I had it on tape. I could listen over. And then go back with additional questions, ways of perhaps deepening the conversation, taking it further. And so one thing led to another, and it became 20 years later. And with many of those people whom I first interviewed in the late 70s, it became a continuing conversation, certainly not every week, not even necessarily every year, but in one way or another, in ongoing reflection about their experiences and about what it is to be a survivor during the years both up to that point and since, and during the years that so much has changed as well.
There's a sense of accumulation. I mean, you not only were actually transcribing it, so there was a cumulative experience for you that as you're going over the tapes, writing it out, but there's also the accumulation of what they were telling you, and then you were starting to be able to interpret that to a certain extent.
Yeah, doing it this way enabled me, as I mentioned, Jim, when we spoke, I did all the transcribing myself. And, you know, as anyone knows who transcribes this kind of material, it's labor intensive. I mean, it takes a lot of time. But you learn what's in those tapes very well, because you're going back, you want to catch every and ah and exactly what was the word there. So you're not just listening once, you're listening time and time again to little sections. So it really becomes part of you. That also gave me the chance to think about, well, what's being said? How is it being said? How is the story being formed? How are these words being chosen? Why these words perhaps and not those words? In any interview, you know, there's always things that one misses that you could pick up, I could pick up in listening again. So that gave me the opportunity to go back the following time and say, you know, we were talking about this or that. You had said this. Could you deepen that a little bit for me? Is this what you meant by that? It became very collaborative. I mean, again, it's I think one of the advantages of talking with people several times is they become involved in the process. I mean, people had the opportunity to say, as I came up with my hypotheses, sometimes right, sometimes not, about what someone may have meant by something. Again, what a psychologist does all the time. They had the opportunity to say, no, that's not what I meant. Oh, yeah, that is what I meant, or to deepen it with me. And I think this is also, if I may say, one of the differences between interviewing people over time and the typical one-time testimony or oral history interview that we have. Those are very important, clearly, for the record, for archives, often for survivors and their families themselves to have a record. But the model there is, for the most part, the survivor has their story, their testimony. It is bestowed, given, and then received and gathered, but it doesn't become really a collaborative knowing together, really working together. Whereas going back and forth, it did feel more and more collaborative. Survivors themselves were interested. Well, why did I choose that word? Well, why did I tell the story in this way and not that way? Well, why was I thinking of it in this way at that time? So they became very much not only fellow interpreters and researchers, but some of the key concepts of this study really came from them. I mean, some of the primary concepts and constructs were first voiced by survivors themselves.
Well, you talked about not only is it listening, but their need is apparently to recount, to share what they had with someone else, and sometimes that was quite difficult.
Yeah, there's a core paradox that runs throughout this work, and I think with survivors retelling in general. Elie Wiesel writes somewhere, it's as impossible to talk about it as not to talk about it. This book, in a way, locates itself right between those two impossibilities. And the key for Wiesel, of course, is that you have to hold on to both at once. It's impossible to talk about it. It's impossible to find the words, to find the forms that will really convey what it was to have experienced, to have witnessed these experiences. At the same time, and this is the side we tend not to think, I think, as much about, it's impossible not to speak of it. One could ask, why is it impossible not to speak? Why not just be silent? And certainly, it's true, some survivors have chosen over the years not to speak of it. But I think what Wiesel meant, and what many other survivors who also say something similar intend to say, I think of the analogy of waking from a nightmare. When we wake from a nightmare, terrible, vivid, horrible nightmare, and if we're lucky enough to be lying next to someone whom we care about and whom we know cares about us, what's the first thing we want to do? We want to say, you won't believe the terrible thing I dreamed, terrible nightmare I dreamed. That's part of, for us, waking up. It's part of, for us, coming out of the paralysis, and even actually the loss of voice. Part of what a nightmare is, classically, almost everyone describes it as, besides not being able to move, it's not being, you want to call for help and you can't go anywhere. You can't get a voice. So part of waking up, part of retelling is literally coming alive again, getting one's voice back again. This, I think, it's almost a biological thing, and it's part of what survivors mean when they talk about, like Wiesel, that it's impossible on some level not to talk about it. And in fact, there was actually a fair amount early on. We also tend not to know this. Before the big oral history projects and testimony projects that we have today, there were projects right at Liberation. During the first year, there were thousands of testimonies, in most cases written down. This was before the days of audio tape, for the most part, certainly before videotape. But there was a lot of retelling and recounting right at the beginning.
Didn't you have that story about, was it Paula?
Yes, one of the interesting people whom I've gotten to know very well, still a very close friend whose name is Paula in the book. I should say all these names are pseudonyms, including the first name. This is just to protect people's privacy. I think she personally would be very happy to be known by her own name, but I wanted to be consistent. But Paula kept an extraordinary diary. She was in Birkenau, which is part of Auschwitz. Like most of the people in Auschwitz, in January 45, Auschwitz was evacuated. They basically moved most of the prisoners out and began what were called the death marches, long trains of prisoners moving back into Germany for the most part as the Red Army, the Soviet Army, advanced from the east. So Paula spent the last 3 months of the war on one of these death marches. People were dying, as she says, like flies. The cold, if you fell behind, you were shot, beaten to death. All the ways one could be killed continued during this time. She's a 15-year-old girl at this time. She happens at liberation, one of the little groups was sort of split off, and they were in effect abandoned by the guards, the German guards, in what had been a former prisoner of war camp. So there were soldiers there from Yugoslavia, from Britain, from France. No other Holocaust survivors, but she was in a little group of survivors. She started to write 2 days after being in this little camp. She doesn't even recall exactly how it happened. And in fact, when we first spoke, she didn't recall having written at all. It was in our third interview. She had said, no, we weren't ready to talk about it then. We weren't really ready to think about it. We were coming back to life. We were just trying to eat, to sleep, to enjoy a shower, to enjoy a bed, you know. But in our third interview, she pulled out this diary that she had kept during that time. And what she writes in the diary, to her surprise, in reviewing it so many years later, she wrote, we're telling everybody about the crematoria. Whether we want to or not, we're telling everybody about this image, the flames in front of my eyes. So she herself had this compelling need to retell at that time, as impossible as it was to really convey it. The need was there, but interestingly, she had forgotten herself that it was there. This was a part of the history of her own retelling that she herself had forgotten until we spoke about it. And in a way, it's a microcosm of the bigger picture. It's a part of the general history of retelling that we tend not to know as much about.
Oh, one of the things about the remembering is the fact that these experiences were really embedded in these people. I mean, it had been burned into them, to use a metaphor, into their physiological self as well as psychological state. So that when you're talking about what they're telling you, it's someplace other beyond just the conscious self, and you talk about that.
Yeah. The whole nature of memory for these kinds of experiences is still something that psychologists are trying to work hard to figure out, and this entails thinking not only about Holocaust survivors but other victims of massive trauma. Is memory imprinted in a different way? Does it take a different form? Is it remembered in a distinctly different way? What I can tell you, and again this goes with the ways that survivors themselves become collaborators, whatever the psychologists think, that's what the survivors themselves say. They are constantly talking about the difference between, and they'll use this phrase, so-called normal life or normal memory and those memories. And the distinction seems to be there's a quality of depth and immediacy and potentially of being overwhelmed by those memories, what Charlotte Delbo and others have called deep memory. Charlotte Delbo was a survivor, is a survivor, who wrote a memoir and several essays about her experience in which she talks about deep memories being distinct from everyday and normal memory. And the quality of deep memory is its immediacy, its physical quality, its sensory quality, smells, sights, re-experiencing. Usually it doesn't take narrative form or story form. It appears almost like a detached image all by itself. That's overwhelming. And survivors in general don't always remember, in fact, don't usually remember directly through deep memory. It's there, but it's screened through other ways of construing and certainly other ways of retelling, giving it a kind of context. And so someone like Delbo suggests, as do other survivors with whom I've spoken, that sometimes people can talk about it And it's as though it didn't really quite happen to them. There's a certain distancing that's possible. There's a certain overall picture, as my friend Paula would say, about it. And at other times, it's like one of these ponds, where the warm water and the cold water flip upside down. There's a kind of an inversion. And the deeper memory, the more direct and, in fact, emotionally overwhelming memory comes up to the surface. And at that time, it can be, well, almost impossible to speak, because that kind of memory tends to be, again, like that nightmare that can take away your voice entirely.
There was one detail that we were talking about the number of people that we may be able to reconstruct to a certain extent, maybe a limited thing where it's a difficult situation, right, or threatening or overwhelming. But what you're talking about in the book and in our conversations is how overwhelming hundreds and thousands of people packed together in the same place,
right,
that we don't have any. That's an example of the gap, that we don't have any frame of reference,
right,
to understand what that was like.
Yeah, we tend, when we think about these experiences, even those of us who spend a lot of time thinking hard and reading memoirs, we tend to picture ourselves alone, say in the camps, or maybe with a few others. We have these images from some of the newsreel footage at Liberation, some of the films that have been made. We tend to think of people sort of spread out, but in fact, in most circumstances, it was, as you suggest, an immense crowd, and not only a crowd of people, but people in the most agonized need, constantly beseeching one, constantly asking either to others, to God, to the world, to nobody but themselves, water, food, anything to make a connection. So in that situation, one is surrounded by need that one, for the most part, cannot respond to, cannot help. And this is something that Primo Levi, survivor, writer, describes. Part of the experience of shame, in retrospect, is this memory of being surrounded by such incredible human need and having to get used to the fact that for the most part there wasn't a darn thing you could do. Sometimes you could do small, as he says, there were little bits of solidarity you could establish. This was quite common, by the way, in the camps, particularly among women, but not solely among women, where with one or two people, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5, again, my friend Paula, small families could be formed. Not necessarily people who were related before, sometimes people from your hometown, and you would have a kind of an affinity group, a solidarity group with that group, but not beyond it. So even if you could care and do some sharing among your group, you'd still be surrounded by other people who may or may not have their own group, new people coming in. And so the experience of not being able to help, in the memory of not being able to help, is a key part of the memory that survivors carry. And I think, again, it's an aspect that we tend, looking back, trying to imagine, to miss. That aspect is not as somehow obvious to us.
I thought one of the interesting things you told me is that terror was one of the key things. Was the like the nightmare of being unable to vocalize. Right. It was the nightmare of not, like you're saying, being able to do anything, right. And that's what was. Some people even died from not being able to resolve to get out of that situation, right. That it was just too much.
Right. And again, the survivors have different ways of talking about this, and in a way, I'd always like to use their terms rather than the psychologists, because I think they do better at this point still than we do in many ways. But again, my friend Paula and others talk about pulling this shade, being able to somehow, at some point, psychologists would call it dissociation, but it doesn't quite capture what it is. But being somehow able to kind of numb out. Now, we tend, when we think about that, we think of it like a sort of, you pull the shade here, and so the experience is over here, and you're over here, and you're fine. But that's not the way it is. When you numb out, what it means is you, in effect, have to turn off functions. I use the analogy sometimes of all the crazy analogies, but the Apollo 13 space capsule where, people have to retreat into a smaller and smaller space and turn off, vital function. And that's what trauma is if you're going to survive it at all. Emotion, cognition, meaning thinking, responsiveness, all these things need to be shut off. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about dissociation. It's not just sort of, quote, pulling a shade here and then you're just fine on the other side. Now that process, which is in response to overwhelming terror, if you're not able to turn off, or you're not able in a way to stop it, the trick is to turn off enough so that you can go numb, but not so much that you go all the way. Going all the way is to die. And in fact, there were a number of people, we'll never know exactly how many, who died under these circumstances in the Holocaust, as in other circumstances of massive terror, not because they were shot or gassed or beaten or starved, although obviously all those reasons too, but because of overwhelming terror. There is such a thing as again, some psychologists call a psychogenic death, of deadly fear. You can be scared to death, literally. And some people did die because they were literally scared to death. And even if you don't die, obviously survivors survived, they didn't die, and yet they entered into that process. They headed down that road. And so they know in their bones what it is to begin to die. And this is also what survivors say, and it's another thing I think that's hard for us, as luckily for us, thank God for us, that we didn't experience it, to really understand when people say, as survivors do all the time, I died in Auschwitz. I died there, but here I am today. And they're not half dead, They live, for the most part, full, vital lives. And yet, there's a knowledge of death. There's a knowledge of dying, which is also there. And it's, one could say, it's part of that deep memory that we were speaking of before. And so, as a result, survivors often talk about living in two worlds at once. Again, the so-called normal world, normal meanings, normal memory, and this other world, which has at its core death. The knowledge, the inner knowledge of their own death, as well, of course, as the knowledge and the memory of the deaths, the full deaths of all the others, the deaths of identity, the deaths of entire communities, the deaths of a way of life, for many survivors, the deaths of faith. All of these deaths are like concentric circles that go around each other, reinforce each other. And so they live on two tracks at once. I mean, this is the classic metaphor that survivors speak of. There's an ongoing life, which is a real life, and there's an ongoing death, which I want to suggest is a real death. At core, it's a real death. It's not just a metaphor, but again, it has this inner physiological core, which is the beginning to die.
As we're talking about this, we're talking actually also about the limitations on the listening and how it depends on what survivors, how many survivors there are from the different death camps. And you were saying yesterday that there's very few from Treblinka. There's more from Auschwitz. Then there's also the words that are used, and which is the way that they try to convey to us, and we were talking about that. So there's these things that we have to understand in listening, and I think that's an excellent point, that when you're really listening to someone, you also are having to interpret what they're saying.
Yeah.
And one of the delights with your book and your approach is that you accepted what they were saying and tried to understand the rationale or its own logic within that, and work with that.
I tried to. I do think that to enter into these experiences, to listen to survivors well, there are a lot of assumptions which we have to, in effect, bracket. We have to say, in quote, I'll use again their phrase, in so-called normal life, you're either alive or you're dead. You can't be both. These are exclusive categories, but they're not exclusive categories in these experiences, and you have to live. It never adds up. It's not a logical, there's no higher synthesis here. What you do, in effect, as a listener, is you hold on to one side, and you hold on to the other side, and you don't worry about whether it's logical or not. You just say, descriptively, this is how it is. And so when a survivor says, Elie Wiesel, a phrase, this is a passage which I give my students to ponder early on in a course on this topic. Wiesel wrote, Hamlet had it too simple. The problem is not to be or not to be. The problem is, for the survivor, to be and not to be. I say to my students, what the heck does that mean? What can that possibly mean? Of course, they're existential. They have all kinds of theories about it, and they struggle with it. They listen to other survivors. But, and I always learn. Each time I learn from them also, what it may mean. But I think they come with me to the conclusion that whatever else it means, at some point it means suspending some of the usual ways that we tend to assume life is, that we have to assume life is.
Or there's that phrase, making the story.
Yeah.
That is a real issue, both in substance and
Right.
strategies.
Yeah. Well, this is, I think the issue of making a story is another good example of the ways that survivors gave me the concepts that I've needed to make sense of what they experienced. There's a man who's named Leon in the book who repeated the same story in 3 different interviews spaced, several weeks apart. This was back in 1979, so it was early on when I was doing this work. And what was clear is he didn't realize that he had told me this particular episode before. It was the only one that he repeated like that. And it was clear each time he thought, he was telling me for the first time, because we often do that, as one ages. But this was distinctly unlike other memories because of the repetition and because each time he said, when he repeated it, he said, this is the kind of thing I never remember because it was too horrible. But it just comes to me now as we're talking. So here we have a man who keeps remembering what he says he never remembers, but he doesn't remember that he keeps remembering it. Is that I eventually asked Leon himself. This is, again, one of the advantages of knowing people well and talking with people over time, is that I was perfectly comfortable. We were working together. We were really collaborating on these interviews together. It was perfectly comfortable for me to say to him, Leon, this is now the 3rd time we've talked about this story. And I'm wondering why you think it's as important to you as it seems. What is it about this? So he had his own, not just theory, but wonderfully illuminating, I have to say, explanation. And then he said something kind of in general, which became almost my, dare I say, my mantra. I mean, the sort of a key idea in this book. He was talking about his memory in general. And he said, it's not a story, but it has to be made a story in order to convey it, and with all the frustration that implies.